Hey, deserving listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments from my videos from last week. Let's get to it. Love is Blind, Shane and Natalie video. It's Nicole says, the way you described passive aggressive, I totally relate to this. I never realized it, but I am very passive aggressive and I can't help it. Growing up, I held my anger in a lot and it was very hard to express myself. Right. So passive aggressive as a label in our culture is not necessarily related to the passive aggressive in the clinical literature. We've been using the term passive aggressive for 100 years in my field. And when you think about the term, it makes it very clear. Aggressive, meaning hostile, meaning being mean to someone, being hurtful to someone, trying to attack someone. And then passive, meaning that it's hidden, it's around the bush. It is, not very overt. It's not obvious that you're being hostile. So you're being hostile and mean to someone in a way that is not very detectable, but does often affect the other person. So passive aggressive behaviors can be, while it's someone at work, you sabotage them. You sabotage a project that you're working on, or you talk bad about them behind their back. Or in a relationship, you might cheat on a partner because you're really angry at them, but you don't know how to express it to them. You might sabotage certain things that they're doing around the house. Or again, you might talk bad about them behind their back. I'm having a hard time. I'm trying to think of all my clients. So you might even break into their computer or into their home. I've had passive aggressive people that I would tell me that as a way of trying to get back at authority figures that they felt wronged by, they would actually break into their homes or offices, kind of mess things up and then leave. It sounds psychopathic, but it wasn't. It was a deep need to express one's anger, but feeling like you can't. And so when, as a child, you are punished, maybe abused, such that you learn to be angry and incurs a lot of violence to you or abuse to you or rejection or something, you learn, I cannot express my anger. Not only can I not express it, I can't feel it. I can't even really acknowledge it. The anger is down there, and so it has to go somewhere. It has to be expressed some way, because anger is good. Anger is necessary. Anger is natural. Anger is a response to injustice, and there's a lot of injustice, not only on the political and societal scale, but in the individual scale. You're in the second grade and someone takes your pencil. That's an injustice. Or your teacher in the 10th grade assigns too many assignments. Or your partner is not listening to you as you're talking about what you're going through. That is an injustice, and you get hurt and then you get angry about it. And in a best case scenario, the anger motivates you to say, hey, what you're doing I don't like. And if you feel you can't express that anger, just as a rule, you are experiencing all this injustice and you have all this hurt and all this anger that needs to go somewhere, and it will come out passively or in a hidden way, sometimes even hidden to the individual. And so when I've treated people like this, it's a matter of helping them to get in touch with their anger and express it. There are a lot of people who have no connection with their anger, and a lot of times it's considered a plus. People will meet passive-aggressive people, and they will seem like the nicest people in the world. You'll just be like, oh my goodness, you never get angry, you're super chill, you're very accommodating, you listen well, but what's really happening is deep down, they feel an injustice, even if you're not even doing anything to them, because they feel this perpetual sense that they're not being heard and that they're not being respected, because that's what they're transferring from the past. Plus, there's a part of them that's screaming of like, please listen to me, but they don't give any signals off of that. And so if you're close to someone like that, and I'm generalizing, it's not always the case, but it often is, that you can be close to someone who suffers from passive-aggressive personality disorder. And listen to my deep dive on it, by the way. It's for patrons only. That it's similar to dependent personality disorder. You can listen to that as well. Some consider them to be subsets of each other. But anyway, you will be next to those people and you won't be doing anything wrong to them, but because they feel like they're being ignored, not because you're ignoring them, but because they're ignoring themselves and they're blaming you for it, they will attack you even if you didn't do anything wrong to them. And not all the time, but they can. And so now the passive aggressive personality disordered individual, they're not doing it on purpose. Of course, it's relational trauma that they're reacting to, but it's a relatively unknown personality disorder that is no longer in the DSM. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We all understand that, in the same way that psychopathy isn't in the DSM or sadism isn't in the DSM. We understand those things exist. For whatever reason, the DSM just doesn't include it. But anyway, so now what you're saying, Nicole, is that you do suffer from passive aggressive personality and you can't help it. And that's the case for all personality disorders, is people can't help it. It's not something under people's control. And of course, that's the first thing that happens, is people try to exert control over their personality disorder, but they can't succeed. You need therapy. You need to explore it. You need a lot of emotional regulation. You need a lot of awareness. You need a lot of corrective experiences. And the corrective experience for passive aggressive personality is to be in the presence of someone that is caring and loving and compassionate to you and holding your emotional space while you begin to express your anger, not only at the world and other people, but maybe even directly at the person. So the passive aggressive client, for me, I know we have reached the prime corrective experience place when that client is actually angry at me and they're expressing it overtly. They're saying, I'm angry at you, and I've been angry at you all week because of something you said last session. For them to be able to say that is huge. And that's where you want to. Now, it's not just them doing that, but it's also me responding in a way that's I'm not distant. I'm not like, well, anyway, let's move on. I'm like I'm like, okay, I hear you, and I'm sorry, and I feel like I'm being blamed for something I didn't really do, but that's okay. Maybe I'm wrong. Let's get into it here. And, thank you for trusting me with your anger. And this is great. It's helpful for me to know that. I want to not anger you. And so it's good that you told me. I might not agree entirely with what you're saying, but you're completely safe to express it. But you have to rinse and repeat that over and over and over again before the body and the neurons wire itself such that there's no association of trauma with even just knowing that you're angry. Anyway, and so, Nicole, I hope that you can get that therapy. But I will say that not a lot of therapists understand or even know about this disorder, so you have to maybe look around for a while. But the idea of anger safety is well known to most therapists, I would say. Smriti says, Indian parents are the same. So I was talking about how Natalie's Korean parents and what I think their life is like, and how Korean parents are much more involved in their kids' lives, and there are pros and cons to that. Smriti says, Indian parents are the same. My parents are very involved in my life, which can be great because you have their support whenever you need it, no questions asked. True unconditional love. The flip side is they are always very involved and have an opinion to share with me all the time. As long as you set firm boundaries with them and do not abuse their love, it can be a wonderful relationship. Right. From an American point of view, mainstream American point of view, the way that Indian or Korean parents, and really maybe most parents around the world operate, can feel very intrusive, very disrespectful. But what mainstream American people don't see are all the pros, all the good things to being heavily involved. In fact, I will find that mainstream white Americans will have this almost like suspicion around family members who are interested in your life, and will say, like, why are they calling all the time? Why are you calling your mom every day? Like, it's just the suspicion. I'm always like, what are you suspicious of? Like, what do you think is gonna happen? What's the threat? I don't understand. Like, someone talks to their parents every day. Like, what's the threat there? And I think it's associated for white mainstream Americans with abuse, maybe, like where parents will force kids to contact them every day by guilt tripping them. And it's hard for mainstream white Americans to imagine that adult kids would actually want to talk to their parents every day because it's so foreign to the Northwest European culture anyway. And I don't know about Northwest European today, but I say Northwest European because that's where a lot of the mainstream American culture of the United States came from. Anyway, Julia says, as someone who is Jewish, listening to Dr. Kirk describe Korean American parenting is pretty accurate to my cultural understanding of parenting too. Honestly, I think that kind of parenting is the norm in most cultures because mainstream white Christian culture is the only culture I've experienced that doesn't have this expectation of parenting. While I understand the much more intertwined dynamic can go bad if there's abuse injected into it, to me, the idea of living without it seems like an unbearably sad way to go through the world. Yes, sometimes I have to make sacrifices to please the family collective, but I know that in doing so, I'm buying into an unconditional support structure that will move mountains for me if I ever need it. Yeah, I mean, my family is in that direction, and it's mainly my Japanese side of the family that's like this. My white side of the family isn't so much like this, but my Japanese side of the family is very much more involved than the typical white American family. And I would find that my white American friends would kind of react to, well, there would be two reactions. One they would be jealous, actually. They'd be like, oh, your family, you seem so involved with each other, and you have a vibrant family with, I have 3 siblings, and so there's get-togethers. It's very loud, and there's a lot of laughter, and and everyone always shows up. Like there's never a time when a brother or my sister are just like, yeah, I'm gonna sit this one out. It's like, without a doubt, all the birthdays. In fact, my brother, my sister-in-law, and my mom all had a birthday during Omicron, and we decided to shut down. We usually have a big party, or 3 different parties, and it's been killing me that we had to cancel that party in January to the point that as soon as Omicron subsided, I immediately was just like, calling everyone. I was just like, we got to have that party, even though it's like 3 months. We got to have that birthday party for the 3 of you, even though it's 3 months later, because it's really great. And now I'm definitely not in the Korean American style. Like that's when I see those kinds of families, I'm like, whoa, like that's a lot of involvement. And so I'm much more mainstream white American influenced that way. But yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons. And as you say, Julia, if there's high enmeshment and high involvement and coercion and abuse, then obviously that's terrible. But usually that's not the case. And we have a massive problem with loneliness and isolation and alienation in our white American culture, which results in all sorts of things: depression, anxiety, loneliness, demoralization, violence, drug abuse, depression. Did I mention that? Materialism. Like, there's a lot of problems that come out. In fact, you could almost say most of America's problems are, at least in part, if not in a big way, related and associated with this ethic of independence and separation from other people, namely your family of origin. Not to say that the rest of the world doesn't have loneliness and problems, but we definitely have a problem in mainstream white American culture with that. M in Korea says, your general perception of Korean parents is spot on. I live in Korea and my husband is Korean. I am white British, and his grandma goes over to his parents' apartment every day to do laundry and wash dishes and make side dishes, even though she is quite frail. Occasionally, this dynamic is quite intrusive for me, as his parents feel they have more of a say in our relationship than I expected and feel comfortable with. But I'm coming to appreciate the love and care that they show us, and am very grateful that they have accepted me as a non-Korean. Also, we have a pretty good distance from them since we live in a different city. Ha ha. Right. So sometimes that's the solution, is like to be in a different city, especially when you have your white British preferences that maybe there's a middle ground there. If you lived in the same town as your parents, it might be overwhelming to you and quite normal to your husband. If you lived in another country, it'd be too much in your preference and not enough for his. But living, half an hour away, it's the sweet spot, maybe. Love is Blind, Danielle and Nick video. Grace, so this was the video in which we noticed that boundaries in Danielle's family was a little, permeable. Grace says, I grew up in a similar family when it comes to discussing sex. And all of my life, my parents would express how refreshing it was to have a family that did that. I love that my parents were playful and open about sex and its inherent goodness, especially as I got older and actually had to navigate relationships and dating. I think it really helped me make wise decisions, and to this day, I know I can talk to my mom about anything and ask any question, even about sex. I tried to be that resource for others as well. Right. So again, getting back to mainstream white American culture, which has a lot of roots in Victorian and further back in, Puritan ideas of anti-sex and massive amounts of sex negativity, that when you have parents who will discuss, like in the video with Danielle and her parents, her mom in particular, talking openly about sex, it is deemed as pathological, as disgusting, as ew. And it's like, why? Now, I'm not saying every parent and kid is supposed to be talking about sex openly, especially in the way that Danielle's mom was. Was it Danielle's mom? Anyway, but I'm saying that the pendulum has swung too far. And just even bringing up the subject can sometimes cause people to think like, well, is that sexual abuse? Am I sexually abusing my kids by bringing up the topic of sex? And since there's so much sex negativity and misinformation in the culture, where else is your child going to learn about sex? And sex is such a big part of life, such an important part of life, and so rich with opportunities for abuse and problems and syndromes in one's mind. And so as a parent, do you want your kid to be learning about sexuality from their friends and from the internet? Now, the internet has some good things. Or from their teachers, because some teachers are great about this, but some are not. Some schools are great, some schools are not. And even if a school is doing great things, they're just hitting the surface. So there's a lot of things that you could be helping. At the very least, what you're doing when you're being more open about the topic and less shameful about the topic of sex yourself as a parent is you're modeling for the child, look, we can talk about sex. It's okay. It's not taboo. It's not disgusting. It's not completely off the books here. And so it opens the door for potential conversations down the road. At the very least, so that you can sit down with your kid and just kind of download things to them, like it would be prudent to have back and forth conversations. But if you can't do that with your kid because they've been sex negativized by society and their school, one of the things you can do is you can just sit your kid down and say, look, I don't know, you don't have to say anything back, but I just want to tell you a few things about condoms and STIs and pregnancy, family planning, and about how to make a decision when to have sex, and that you should listen to yourself. You can certainly talk to me about it. Don't feel like you ever need to have sex with someone that you don't want to. Know that you don't have to talk with me about it, but just know that if you do have sex, I'm not going to shame you. There's a thing called LGBTQIA. There's a thing called asexuality. There's a thing called bisexuality. There's a thing called aromanticism. I'm just throwing it all out there. And, I hope that, there's obviously there would be a lot more information there. But so, yeah, Grace, I'm glad that you grew up in a family like that. And trying to talk with mainstream American families or people about this idea, it causes everyone to go, ew, squirm, gross. I don't want to talk about sex in my family. It's just like, and I think the mistake they make is, I'm not saying that parents should sit down and go like, let's watch porn together, because that actually could be abusive to kids. My point is that there are a lot of things to talk about with sex. And when it comes to mainstream American sex negative culture, it's kind of black or white. It's either it's either hardcore porn or you're not talking about sex at all. You know what I'm saying? It's either you're fully describing everything in full detail or you're not talking about it at all. There's a lot of room in between there, you know? Like the idea of enjoying yourself while having sex, or, you know, as a parent, you know, you're talking to your 16-year-old and you're just like, yeah, I remember being sexually active in high school, and you know, it was kind of confusing to me at times, but, you know, I bumbled my way through it. You know, just the acknowledgement, or, you know, I don't know if that's what you say, but point is, it's like there's a lot of different things one could be saying. And generally speaking, if you navigate it well enough, it's a plus for the child, for sure. But weird to onlookers from the outside. And then the next video, Danielle and Nick are fighting about what happened at Danielle's house when Nick was on his phone. AK says, my concern with this relationship is that Danielle's insecurity makes her extremely self-focused and seemingly unaware of Nick's needs. Even in the moment of mini crisis for him, the conversation becomes about her needs and how he's not meeting them. Yeah, so this is where people on the internet will say like, oh my gosh, she's so narcissistic. And there are quote-unquote narcissistic elements to preoccupied attachment and borderline personality. I don't know if Danielle has preoccupied attachment or borderline, but narcissism is associated with that, and it's that self-focus. But it's not out of choice, I hope we all understand. That when, you know, if I were to shoot you in the leg with a gun, and then I started to talk about my feelings, I would think that you wouldn't have the capacity to listen to me talk about my feelings. Well, when you have relational traumas that predates preoccupied attachment and or borderline personality, when you are hurt or when you sense rejection and the threat of being betrayed, it's the same fear and same pain that you feel as if someone shot you in the leg. It's the same neurons in your brain. And it is very difficult, if not impossible, to focus on anything else besides that fear and that pain. So yeah, it is very self-focused, but it's because of the trauma and the complex PTSD. It's not because of some sort of decision that someone makes. Sarah says, I relate to Danielle a lot. I grew up in a household where I had to be hypervigilant all the time because everything was my fault. The family is falling apart, it's my fault. My parents are fighting, it's my fault. It's made me it's made being an adult almost unbearable because I can't handle regular conflict. With that said, your videos are also helpful for me. You make me feel so seen. Good, Sarah. I'm glad that you feel seen. You deserve that. Absolutely. Lauren says, do you think it's productive to ask someone to politely put themselves in your shoes? For example, saying to Danielle, if you were getting texts from your family about your family drama, would you be able to completely ignore the conversation? That's what one might say. The ironic thing is I am so much like Danielle, and I'm intrigued at watching my unreasonable behavior play out right in front of my eyes. Yeah, so it would help, Lauren, potentially, to ask someone to be in your shoes, and Nick could have offered that up a little bit more kindly and said, like, look, I just want you to be in my shoes, you know. And this is something that I will recommend people do, and I personally do a lot, is, look, I'll describe to you my experience, and I don't know if this is going to help or not, because oftentimes people do not interpret you very easily or well. So if I was Nick, I might say something like, you know, look, I just want to tell you what was going on for me. We're going over to your parents' house, and because I love you so much, and I know how important this is to you, I really wanted to make a good impression with your family, but I felt pretty good because I feel pretty good, pretty confident. I've had other similar interactions, and I feel like I'm pretty good in those, so I wasn't nervous particularly. And upon meeting your family, I really enjoyed them. There's some quirkiness to your mom, but I think she's a lovely person. I was really enjoying myself, and it felt good, not only just as an interaction, but it felt important, you know, because this is the first time I met your family. This is a big deal. So it was a really big deal to me. Then, in the middle of it, I started getting these texts. And at first, I'm like, ugh, this is annoying. I'm with Danielle and her family. I don't need to be getting these texts from these randos. I can look at it later. But then I looked at one of them, and it was about X, Y, and Z, and it freaked me out. And I just had to tell you, I had a total fear response. And all I could do, it was like in the movies where, the cameras, I was like, all I could do was focus on this thing. And I was like, and then usually I'm kind of involved in it. They were triangulating me. Usually I'm involved, and maybe it's weird of me to do that, but I just got really triggered by it. And so, I'm trying to pay attention. And I felt like I was doing pretty good. Like 90% of my attention was in the room, but I was still kind of looking back at this thing. And I thought, well, it's kind of rude of me not to address what they're saying right now because of what's happening. And it's usually my response. And maybe I should have just put the phone down looking back, but I don't know. I felt like I could do both. I could absolutely honor the moment, which was a big deal to me, not just because I was trying to impress you, but it was a big deal to me. But, it was a big deal to me. But I was also wondering if I could just kind of address this one thing. And I tried to do it, but then the texts kept coming in, and they knew now that I'm checking my phone. And so I don't know. I was just caught between a rock and a hard place. And Danielle, I get how it would feel to you, but I hope that you could be in my shoes in that situation. In no way was I just being flippant or disrespectful or not recognizing really the beauty of that moment of meeting your family. I mean, this is going to be my mother-in-law, and this is going to be my family. It's a big deal to me. So if Nick had done something like that, would that have helped Danielle? I'm guessing it would, honestly, as you're kind of pointing out, Lauren. However, it's really a huge ask to ask the Nicks of the world to do that, because he has a similar problem, in all likelihood, of attachment insecurity that I think he's come forward and talked about, or people have emailed me saying that he talked about it or something, because he's in his own therapy as well. That for Nick, he, I think, has a complex around criticism and around being blamed for things, and it's deep, deep trauma for him. And so the way he responds is to attack to some extent and to defend, and also to intellectualize things and to become logical, which is a real common dynamic that between Danielle and Nick. And so to ask him to feel secure as he's being what he feels to being attacked unfairly, asking him to be calm and attachment secure and able to regulate, is as much of a big ask as it is to ask Danielle to calm down in those situations as well. But the beauty is they went to couples therapy, and that's when you learn how to understand each other, because you slow things down, and a third party can help. Well, what's happening, hey, Nick, how about you elaborate on that? Don't go to your logical place, go to your emotional, tell her what you were going through emotionally. I'm guessing that's what they're doing, and they're probably going to be great and, be a satisfactory relationship because of that. Anonymous says, wow, I have to give you major props to be able to keep up with any of Neil. Oh, so I was talking about drumming to Neil Peart of Rush, Limelight. To be able to keep up with any of Neil Peart's drumming is a major feat. Mad respect. He's one of the best drummers ever, in my opinion. May Neil Peart rest in peace. Right, he died recently, within the past 5 years, I think. And I think he's one of the best drummers ever as well. Moving Pictures, which is actually one of the albums behind me, is one of my favorite albums of all time. Shout out to Canadians. Danielle and Mohammed, so getting to 90 Day Fiance. Laura says, Danielle is always going to want to talk to Mohammed for one last time. She really is a stalker. She's humiliated and wants retribution, but she also keeps chasing the fantasy. Yeah. The really educational, interesting thing about the Danielle and Mohammed story, and we don't know what really happened. We can only go off of what's being depicted on the show. What's being depicted on the show is absolutely stalking. And we all have, I think, perhaps a cartoonish version of what stalking really looks like if you think about when it happens in movies and TV shows. And certainly it can look like that, but the Danielle stalking is much more common, regardless of gender. You all can see that Danielle is not doing well. She doesn't wake up in the morning and go like, hey, how am I going to ruin someone's life? She is unstable. She is unhappy. She is struggling. She is in love with Muhammad. She does not know how to manage her emotions. She doesn't seemingly have anyone in her life that will help her kind of sift through her feelings. She has a pretty rudimentary defense structure, very childish defense structure. And add all that up, and what you have behavior-wise is stalking, is not respecting boundaries, constant communication, threats, demands, you must talk to me, or else. And then when you do meet up with them, you're like, okay, fine, I'm here. What do you want? And then they're like, well, I don't know. Can't we just talk and hang out? And you're like, really? Like, I just got done a month of threats over texting and you just want to talk? Like, what is going on right now? And as a victim of stalking, you end up being motivated to just please, because you're just like, please don't hire someone to kill me, literally that kind of stuff. And so stalking is a vast majority of the stalking that I have dealt with clinically looks like it's in the ballpark of what Danielle is doing. It doesn't justify, obviously, what Danielle is doing. What she's doing is semi-criminal. But I hope that people understand where it generates from, because it gives us a chance to actually prevent it, meaning lots of therapy. and also, if you're Danielle's friend, not just looking at Danielle and saying, because, from a certain point of view that Danielle's friend has, all of Danielle's behavior is justified, right? Because it's all based on this premise like, well, Muhammad scammed me, therefore he's got to answer for himself. And if you're ever a friend of someone like that, you want to be able to see through that stuff and identify, because you might not think of your friend as a stalker. You might think of your friend as a very vulnerable, sad individual. But those vulnerable, sad people are of the stalkers in the world, they're usually sad and struggling and not doing well. And so if you're a friend of a person like that and you see them stalking someone, or you see them chasing someone else, start asking questions like, I wonder what it would feel like to be that other person. Is this stalking? Is my friend justified really in violating those boundaries? And so then you can help, someone not do that. Habeas Humor says, Dr. Honda is so right that litigation is not the path for emotional satisfaction. Just chiming in here. I just realized Habeas Humor, I always thought, it's a funny little name on YouTube. Of course, you're a lawyer with a name like Habeas Humor. Dr. Honda is so right that litigation is not the path to it. So I was talking about how in the real world, outside of TV and movies, litigation, taking someone to court, suing someone, it often is an impulse because we often have the impulse and pursue it because we're trying to seek satisfaction. We're trying to find balance. They wronged us and something's got to be done about this. And the vast majority of time, although that doesn't, the vast majority of time at the end of the road, when you do spend all tens of thousands of dollars and years in court and all that kind of stuff, there is no satisfaction. In fact, you feel worse sometimes. That isn't to say you should never sue someone. That isn't to say you should never take litigation, liturgic actions. You should never litigate. But I'm saying if you expect some sort of emotional satisfying result, you are barking up the wrong tree. In fact, a lot of times in situations like this, like with Danielle, there is no road to satisfaction aside from actually reaching out to Muhammad and actually talking to him, maybe, because I think that they do have that potential. But anyway, so Habeas Humor, a lawyer, I believe, is saying that as well. I used to tell this to clients who were suing employers for wrongful discrimination. I would say that they have to manage their expectations because they are never going to get an apology or an admission of wrongdoing from the other party. Also, in most cases, they won't even get a verdict in court because it will eventually prove to be wiser to settle the case. Even if they do win at trial, it's not like it is in the movies. In fact, it might even seem anticlimactic, as it will come after years of this exhausting and stressful process, and they will just want it to be over already. Yeah. Again, I'm not saying you should never sue someone. I actually sued someone one time in my early 20s when I was particularly poor. I someone hit me. I was at the full story was we were having a kegger in college. I don't know what y'all call them in your neck of the woods, but we call them keggers, where you buy a keg of beer, and when you announce the party, you're like, we got 3 kegs, and then all the people come and you charge a little bit of money and you hand out the solo cups. And, it's a disgusting thing. There's over drinking and terrible behavior. But anyway, so I'm 21 and we're having one of these keggers, and I don't know why that detail, but I pulled up to the bar in the afternoon, in a sunny summer afternoon, to buy. I was in this parking lot. If for Seattleites, it was Goldie's on 45th. I was actually across the street in the parking lot. It used to be a Payless. Anyway, and the parking was angled parking. Okay, and I had this tiny little Honda Civic hatchback, white Civic. It was actually my parents' car that I just sort of appropriated. But so the parking spots are angled like this, and I'm driving in like this. And then I parked, but I came at it from the other side. But the car is so small that it was easy to do that. It was this tiny little thing. Just think of, like, back then Honda Civics were like smart cars, or so I pulled in, and I was a little askew, you know what I mean? But I was within the lines, totally within the lines. And this big old truck next to me was backing out. So I'm sitting, with a couple friends in my Honda while someone is in the bar getting the kegs. And I remember we could kind of see them go to the back because they were usually, anyway, so years and years ago. And the car next to me, this truck, starts to pull out. And they clipped my back, he clipped my back bumper and just ripped it off. Just like rip. And the whole bumper just went clunk. And I get out of the car and I'm like, oh, well, this is pretty cut and dry. I mean, I was parked in a parking spot for 25 minutes and you just ripped off my bumper. So yeah, we don't need to call the cops, go ahead and give me your information. And the guy's like, yeah, it's totally my fault. I'll pay for it. Okay. So I get an estimate, and it was $400 to pick up the bumper, put it in my back hatchback thing. And the guy says, this is back, before email. It's just, I think I literally was writing him letters in the mail. And he said, no, I'm not going to pay for it. Or I called him on the phone or something. And because it wasn't his fault. And I said, how could it possibly be not your fault? And he said, well, because you were parked kind of behind me or something like that. And I said, even if I was literally parked behind you, that doesn't mean you can hit my car. It means I should move my car. I was sitting in my car. But it doesn't mean you can just rip the bumper off of my car, and I was not behind you. I was totally in my own parking space. And he's like, well, my wife says that I'm not to blame. And I'm like, well, your wife wasn't there, so pay up, pal. And he's like, sorry, I'm not going to do that because it's not my fault. And, back then, $400, and I guess to some extent still, but back then, I mean, that was a lot of money. Like, there was just no way that I was going to go down without a fight for that bumper. And so took him to small claims court, had to go down to the, municipal building, had to, file some form, small claims form. And we finally get into court, and it's a year later. And we're in front of the judge, and I think, this is a pretty cut and dry case. I don't know why we're even here, but him and his wife are standing there. And I explain the situation. And then he claims, well, but he pulled in. Remember I said that I pulled in from the opposite direction. One, I don't know how he would know that I did that, but he said that. And I think I said, yeah, I probably did. And I thought, well, that's not a defense, right? That's not just because I pulled in from the other side, that doesn't mean anything if I was within the lines. And again, even if I wasn't, that doesn't mean you can rip off my bumper. Like, it doesn't, just because I'm parked bad doesn't give you the right to damage my car. It means you should tell me to move my car, but he didn't tell me to move my car because my car wasn't in the way because I was completely within the lines. Anyway, so he makes that claim, and I'm thinking, well, this is a cut and dry case. I'm sure that the judge started to consider that his case was valid, that I was to blame, or that he wasn't to blame. And I'm like, am I in crazy town? And this actually goes to what habeas corpus is talking about. It's like, or habeas humor was talking about. It's like, and later as a therapist, I learned, like, judges are not the pinnacle of wisdom that we make them out to be. They are human beings with faults and biases and problems and bad moods and bad takes and bad politics and, triggering. And, they are humans who make mistakes all the time. I learned that as a therapist who went to court frequently. Anyway, so the judge starts to consider that and I'm like, that's $400, man. Like, I need that money because up until that point, I was literally duct taping my bumper to my car, and I got a ticket for it once because it was not supposed to be that way, And I'm like, this person is now costing me money. Anyway, so I can't remember what I said. I said something like, well, but I was completely within the lines, and I think I said I have a small Honda Civic, and then the judge was like, oh, you have a small Honda Civic. Oh, okay, that makes sense. Anyway, ruling for the plaintiff, and I'm like, what is the difference if I had a big car or a small car? How come this judge is I just thought, I won the case, but I'm like, I don't understand. Am I in, crazy court? Then the guy is now obligated to pay me, but I didn't realize this. The defendant could just not pay, which is what happened. So then I fast forward like a year later. So it's just 2 years after the accident. And I'm like, where's my money? I keep calling him. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, we don't agree with what the judge said. And I'm like, well, the judge said, and he's like, well, we still don't have to pay. And I'm like, well, why the F did we go to court? If there's no oversight or punishment, like, what do we do? So then I'm like, someone tells you I got to go back to small claims. I'm like, it's been years ago, and my bumper is looking okay because I did a good job with the duct tape, and this is a long story. But anyway, so then one day in the mail, I get a letter, a long handwritten letter, because that's what we did back in 1993, and not only were there $400, but it was $420. So there was interest. The guy wrote this long letter, and he said, I always knew I was to blame. My wife was in my ear, and I didn't know what to say, and I'm so sorry, and I've wronged you, and I was wrong from the beginning, and here's a little extra. And I did not buy a new bumper. I probably bought more kegs. Priorities in college. When you get a little fender bender and your car still runs, you don't, $400, that pays for a lot of fun times when you're 23. Anyway, what was I talking about? Darcy and Stacy. Laura says, thanks for mentioning mansplaining. Yeah, so Octavia was accusing Florian of mansplaining when he was just, I'm like, that's not mansplaining's a thing, but that ain't mansplaining in my eyes. But anyway, so Laura says, thanks for mentioning mansplaining. I used to work on cars as a profession. When a car overheated in traffic, quite a few men came to me about my car, which sometimes was really kind, but I will never forget the man who insisted it was my oil and carried on to point to things that were wrong. I actually stopped working on cars because of blatant sexism every day. So many stories. Right. One of the most satisfying Reddit posts that I will see once every 6 months is a woman who is an expert on cars is looking at her engine, and men come up and start telling her what's wrong, and she's like, she's like, I'm a mechanic, will you shut up? You know what I mean? And so it's just so satisfying to see the look on the men's faces of just like, huh? It's like mansplaining just reduced down to this one little moment of like justice, and because of course justice around mansplaining almost never happens. But so Laura, I'm so sorry that you no longer work on cars, because I would have loved to have seen that. You could have made millions on YouTube just outing all these sexist, mansplaining men about cars to you. I mean, that just would have been so great to see, Anyway. Gino and Jasmine. Ryu says, whenever my spouse complains or vents about something, she expects me to listen and show empathy. Out of habit, I've always tried. So I was talking about, how Gino is always trying to solve he's trying to solve her problem rather than just listening to her, right? And trying to solve her problem in this really disrespectful way. It's like, oh, you're going to lose your job because I gave someone a picture of your nude body. Oh, well, no problem. You can just get another job. Or that kind of, we all saw it. Anyway, so Ryu says, but I was talking about how what Gino is doing is a very common thing, or almost universal thing, that people will try to fix instead of really fix the problem, which is the person just wants to be heard. Ryu says, whenever my spouse complains or vents about something, she expects me to listen and show empathy. Out of habit, I always tried to solve her issue. I can catch myself from doing that nowadays, but I definitely see that's what Gino is thinking. He was trying to find a solution. Right. And this, often is associated with men, that they will try to solve, but women do this too. Everyone does this. It is a thing. It's actually rare that when someone is venting, that someone will just listen. In fact, one of the things that I have to, beat out of my trainees emotionally is this notion of just listening. Every therapist I've ever trained, every therapist I can think of off the top of my head, maybe not every, but almost universally, every trainee that I have worked with will run into this experience as they're first starting to become a therapist. They're an intern and they're working with their first clients. And often the trainee is scrambling to try to fix the problem, and they feel very responsible for fixing the client's problems, right away within the first session. And even though intellectually they understand that's irrational, their gut is driving them towards that conclusion. And so there's this compulsion often and motivation to just throw ideas out there, Oh, you've been suffering from depression for 10 years. Well, how about you try to, give yourself self-talk, or how about you, go for a walk outside? And, these aren't bad suggestions, but it can really be demeaning to the individual. And it's not really the task at hand, because the task at hand is the client just wants to be heard and understood, and they want to be able to just vent, like, this is frustrating, I'm depressed, this is awful. And the primary, at least the foundational therapeutic action, is just listening. And so when I would try to teach that and work with these trainees over the years, because a lot of trainees I would work with for 1 or 2 years straight, and eventually we'd get to this point where they'd be like, well, I feel like I'm just listening, because they let go of trying to fix and trying to provide some sort of skill. And they'll see, like, I feel like I'm just listening. And it's like nails on a chalkboard to me, just listening. Let me talk about just listening. Just listening is the foundation of human experience and empathy and compassion and relationships. Just listening is the foundation of psychotherapy. Just listening is what Freud and Breuer did back in the day. Just listening is the entire basis of humanistic psychology, which is arguably the most scientifically rigorous form of therapy, given positive regard and empathy and compassion and rupture repair and alliance, all the things that we know in psychotherapy to be true for all forms of therapy are smack dab in the middle of humanistic psychotherapy, and obviously very central to modern forms of psychodynamic therapy. And really other forms of therapy as well, but mainly humanistic and psychodynamic. Basically, the entire foundation of therapy is based on just listening. They literally have a research topic of listening well, and how when you listen well, regardless of what you get into in session, will improve outcomes, regardless of what the client is coming in for. So just listening is, in fact, what I will say when I'm ranting to my students. I'll say, You could literally just listen for the rest of your career and do better than if you did something else. Like if you just listen to your clients and do nothing else, just listen, and you can help people and cure them of so many problems. And this obviously goes for your spousal relationships or whatever, your personal relationships. When someone's venting, the foundational thing that someone is looking for, almost universally, I mean, unless they're bleeding out of their arm and they're like, I'm bleeding, they don't want to just be heard. They want a solution. They want, you to get a tourniquet or something, or a whatever, compress. Anyway, unless something like that is happening, what they are looking for at first, at the very least, and potentially only what they're looking for, is to be heard. Someone's venting. They're like, this is happening for me at work, and my boss is doing this. Now you start having all that idea. Well, maybe if you talk back, maybe if you file a complaint, maybe if you go above their head, maybe if you quit your job, maybe if you stand up for yourself, maybe if you do better. You have all these ideas. Great. So there's two things. One is just listen. Two, do you think that your partner has not come up with those ideas themselves? Because ask yourself, if I'm coming up with this idea, am I some sort of genius, or has my partner probably also come up with this idea before, right? So think about that, because to, one, not listen and to try to solve, it gives this idea to your partner that you believe they can't come up with those easy solutions, unless you're some sort of genius. In all likelihood, your partner has also come up with that solution. And to be told that solution from your partner as you're trying to solve their problem that they're not asking you to solve, it can feel incredibly demeaning and like you're being treated like a child. Like, yes, Captain Obvious, yes, I realize that I could file a complaint. Do you not think like that hasn't occurred to me? You know what I mean? Plus, when you're not being heard, it's very insulting for someone to try to solve your problem. It's just like, because it's like, not only am I not being listened to, but I'm being condescended to. Thank you for being a great support. You know what I mean? So, and it's so universal that I have to deprogram and unbrainwash students and trainees to stop doing this. It's such a universal thing. So, yes, Gino, everyone, stop it. Just listen only. And the nice thing about if you're going to give a tip, one of the best things you can ever do is say, would you like me to give you some advice? Just ask the question. Wouldn't you want to know if it's consensual or not? Listen well, and then after you're listening, you say, hey, I got some advice. Do you want some advice? There's a thing called unsolicited advice, and there's a thing called solicited advice. Solicited advice is consensual. Unsolicited is non-consensual. Stop offering advice. Oftentimes, I will say that. I'll say, would you like me to give you some advice? And the person will be like, nah, I'm not really into it. And I'll be like, totally cool. Because one of the worst things that and I've done it, of course, I've committed this crime myself. One of the worst things that I will cringe at myself about is just unsolicited advice that is condescending or just unhelpful, or I'm reducing it down to this really simple thing. So, people, just listen. Just listen. And reflect. Wow, that must be hard. Wow, that sounds frustrating. Wow, that's distressing. Wow, that sounds scary. Wow, that sounds like it hurts. Wow, that's rough. I could see how, or at the very least, if you really just want to offer something, talk about your own experience. And some people don't like this, so you have to gauge it, but you can just be like, wow, I've been there before. I had a boss like that once too. I hated it. So, you can say stuff like that, but just that. And then the other thing is, if they're looking for advice, they might even ask for it. If you refrain from giving advice and solving their problems, the person might say, well, what do you think I should do? Wouldn't that be great? Instead of not listening, not validating, not having compassion, and just unsolicited advice. Like, stop it. Jay says, thank you for what you said about autism, doctor. So I was talking about how, I won't say it all over again, but about people speculating that Gino is on the autism spectrum. And what I was saying in summary is he might and he might not. Jasmine might be on the spectrum. We don't know. But just because someone is a little socially awkward and a little nerdy does not mean they have autism. It might mean that, but this simplistic idea of autism is maddening, really. Jay says, thank you for what you said about autism, Dr. K. As someone with autism, it pains me to hear people likening everything I go through with being a little weird and nerdy. Yeah. The Kanye episode with Berto. Sarah says, this talk was very interesting, and I also found the doc inspirational. Yeah, I found it inspirational too, although disturbing. I was hoping you would discuss his new music video. It's a claymation depiction of himself kidnapping Kim and Pete and burying Pete alive. I honestly did not watch the whole thing because I was so disturbed. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video and if you think there is a possibility of someone getting hurt. It really did shake me. I can't imagine watching it and being one of the characters in it or seeing my mom or best friend in that type of depiction. Yeah, so as we were recording the episode on Kanye, more things were happening. And so I feel like Berto and I should do a follow-up because there's been more of him posting kind of rants on video rants on the internet. And although I still stand by what we said, so I don't think it really changes what we were saying, because my whole conceptualization of Kanye was, in terms of what we've seen, which I don't know if any of it is true, is that he grew up with abandonment, as he's talked about, that probably resulted in him resorting to defensive narcissism. Not massive amounts of it, but a good moderate dose, and a huge sea of insecurity underneath it all. In addition to that, and perhaps separate from that, he also suffers from bipolar disorder, as exhibited by some of his behavior. Also, he's a bit socially awkward. That's independent of his abandonment and attachment insecurity and his bipolar. I think he also is a little socially awkward. And he might even admit that. He even raps about that sometimes. Anyway, so also drug addiction is in there as well. He's talked about Percocet addiction. It's hard to know how that would affect him. I've treated plenty of people with opiate addictions and it doesn't really affect one's personality. It obviously can make people be very subdued and tired and droopy-eyed, but ongoing addiction use, because usually people are trying to make sure their dosage doesn't wipe them out, keeps them functional. It sometimes doesn't really affect people's personality that much. Anyway, so if to my memory, that was, he's a regular human being with a whole personality. He can't be defined by bipolar. He can't be defined by his abandonment or his insecurities or what seems to be narcissism, or, he can't be defined by his talent. He's a full human being, as all of us are. And the documentary kind of shows that. So I still stand by that. And I think what we're seeing in the video and other kinds of things is an expression of his attachment insecurity. And, we all understand that when you have abandonment trauma and then you go through a divorce, especially if someone's leaving you, you might be triggered, especially if you're being humiliated in front of the world, to get very, very hurt. And it's going to really challenge your narcissistic veil, your narcissistic defenses, such that you go deeper than that to your massive insecurity. And you're going to potentially come out swinging. And also, he also seems to exhibit some childishness often when he's triggered, and hasn't really developed past a certain age. It's hard to know why that would be. We could say relational traumas. We could say the death of his mom. Who knows? But so we wouldn't be surprised if a 14-year-old didn't have those kinds of impulses of like, I'm really pissed at her and I'm going to go beat him up. Like that's his general vibe with Kim and Pete. And so I consider it an outgrowth of all of the things that I was saying. Of course, I can't really know that because I'd have to assess him, but it seems coherent as an analysis. Having said all that, Sarah, yeah, I mean, if you just break this down, this is deplorable behavior, and no one should be applauding this, and everyone should be criticizing it. He is essentially, he would argue, an artistic way, but that doesn't make it okay, glorifying and justifying killing someone that happens all the time. There are many people, there are many jilted ex-husbands who will become violent and murder not only their their former partner, but who their former partner is with. This is something that happens all the time. And Kanye is essentially saying that that's what his intention. Now, he would argue, I'm not really going to do it. This is just a fantasy. It's just an expression of art. And, I'd say, okay, but it's concerning. And I could see, Sarah, particularly if you have traumas in this region, that it would absolutely be triggering. Do I think Kanye is going to do something? I don't think so. People who are violent will show signs. There's usually a ladder of escalation. Maybe not to us. Maybe we don't see that escalation. But if he is potentially violent, I'm guessing that people around him would notice things and hopefully would do something about it if he was escalating. Can someone who is manic, hypo and full manic, do something like this? Maybe it could be a factor. Of course, most people with bipolar never commit anything close to murder, let alone violence. So, yeah. But in the videos when he's online, he just seems confused and hurt and doesn't have any way of soothing himself. And again, when you add bipolar in there, like when you have a mood disorder, it can just take over your perspective. Like no matter what you say to yourself and no matter what data is coming in from other people, with a mood disorder, not always, but you can become completely convinced of a very negative point of view that is completely discarded once one stabilizes on their meds or stabilizes with the mood cycle. So that also could be a part of it. Is Kim and Pete in danger? I mean, if I were Pete and Kim, I would take it seriously. I would beef up the security, no doubt. But would I worry if I were them, day and night? No. But I don't know. I don't know what's happening. And yeah, it's disturbing. And yeah. So maybe there'll be a part 3 to the Kanye episodes. Liana says, never connected the air of superiority that Kanye exhibits to abandonment. I agree with Berto. I've been called arrogant without intentionally trying to be, but was also abandoned by my mom and was given praise my entire childhood. Thank you guys for discussing and sharing. Right. Well, I'm glad that you related to that, Liana. It's a common scenario of abandonment and overcompensation by the remaining parent of praise and this underlying feeling of worthlessness that you easily develop a narcissistic defense around because someone's praising you all the time, and maybe you're talented at things as well. That gives you that ability to really lean into that as like a marker of evidence of self-worth, and you're always chasing that thing of recognition and being better than other people to make yourself feel kind of good, even though deep down you feel terrible. It's possible that Kanye has that syndrome. I don't know. I'd have to ask him. But yeah, okay, people. Well, that was interesting. I feel like we got into some interesting stuff there. And everyone out there, please you know what? So I was going to try to say take care of yourself because you deserve it in different languages, but no one submitted anything, so I'm just going to do Icelandic. But looking at the letters, I feel like I'm going to butcher it.
Farðu vel með þig. Farðu vel með þig.
That last bit, I can't even really hear it, but passau zu faith. Because you do, you really do.